to act and not be acted upon, how education, economic systems, and rampant consumerism undermine self-reliance. The hardest problems to solve are those we don't see. We typically consider education a fundamental building block of self-reliance. But while that's often true, it's important to understand the history of modern educational design and that it was actually intentionally structured to decrease the self-reliance of participants. The philosophical underpinnings of American schooling and many other educational systems worldwide had their start in 1806, when Napoleon's amateur army beat the professional soldiers of Prussia at the Battle of Jena. Prussia was in the business of selling mercenaries, and losing a battle like that was serious. The loss was attributed to the unwillingness of certain Prussian subordinates to accept and execute the orders of their superiors. Almost immediately afterwards, a German philosopher named Johann Fichte delivered his now famous Addresses to the German Nation, which ultimately became one of the most influential documents in modern history. In effect, he told the Prussian people that the party was over and that the nation would have to shape up through a new utopian institution of forced schooling in which everyone would learn to take orders. In his own words, these addresses should lead you first of all, and with you the whole nation, to a clear perception of the remedy which I have proposed for the preservation of the German nation. The remedy indicated was an absolutely new system of German national education, such as has never existed in any other nation. The new education must be able to surely and infallibly mold and determine, according to rules, the impulses and actions of its pupils. The new education must consist essentially in this, that it completely destroys freedom of will. Such a will can henceforth be relied on with confidence and certainty. If you want to influence him at all, that is the student, you must do more than merely talk to him. You must fashion him, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot desire something different from what you want him to desire. This is how the world got compulsion schooling at the end of a state bayonet for the first time in human history. Modern forced schooling started in Prussia in 1819 with a clear vision of what centralized schools could deliver. Obedient soldiers to the army, reliable workers for the mines, well-subordinated civil servants for government positions, compliant clerks for industry, and citizens who thought alike about major issues. Schools were engineered to create an artificial national consensus on matters that had been worked out in advance by leading German families and the heads of institutions. Schooling paved the way for unity among all the German states, eventually unifying them into Greater Prussia. The plan worked. Prussian industry boomed from the beginning, and they soon found success once again on the battlefield. In Prussia, the purpose of the Volksschule, which educated 92% of the children, was not intellectual development at all, but socialization in obedience and subordination. Thinking was left to the Realschulen, in which 8% of the kids participated. Steve Mann told me of his children's plight after being assigned to a lower category of students at their Prussian-style school in South Africa. On one test, his child received a higher score than some of the other kids in class, but had received a lower grade. When Steve complained, the teacher explained it wasn't possible for those in the lower group to receive higher grades than those in the higher category. Another friend in town visiting from Luxembourg last month told me of the nightmare his children experienced after being assigned to the lower student category or trade school classification upon matriculation. He then decided to homeschool his kids, to which the Ministry of Education responded that they would forcibly take his children from him and they would become wards of the state for attempting to educate his children without government permission. He is an expatriate of U.S. citizenship running a company there. The Prussian approach is alive and well today. For the masses, intellectual development was regarded with managerial horror as something that caused armies to lose battles. Prussia concocted a method based on complex fragmentation to ensure that its school products would fit the grand social design. Some of this method involved dividing whole ideas into school subjects, each further divisible. Some of it involved short periods punctuated by a horn so that self-motivation in study would be muted by ceaseless interruptions. There were other techniques of training, but all were built around the premise that isolation from first-hand information and fragmentation of the abstract information presented by teachers would result in obedient and subordinate graduates properly respectful of arbitrary orders. Lesser men would be unable to interfere with policymakers because while they could still complain, they could not manage sustained or comprehensive thought. Well-schooled children would not be able to think critically or argue effectively. Prussian teaching paralyzes the moral will as well as the intellect. It's true that sometimes well-schooled students sound smart because they memorize many opinions of great thinkers, um, but they're actually badly damaged because their own ability to think is left rudimentary and undeveloped. Years ago, I read a book about the extradition and trial of a Nazi war criminal named Adolf Eichmann. At the time, I remembered wondering how so many Germans could have been convinced to go along with something so evil. Eichmann described the German environment as one of ubiquitous complicity. The author of the book, a Jew herself, concluded that Eichmann believed he was simply doing his job. Quote, "He did his duty. He not only obeyed orders, he also obeyed the law." End quote. In his autobiography, Elder F. Enzio Busha wrote this of the time: "It is not easy to talk about this knowing what I know now, but that helps explain the background of our society in that time. We believed what we heard. The magic of the music and the uniforms, the philosophy and talks, all were very powerful and convincing. Only now does it become clear that it was a very specifically designed educational system that made the Holocaust possible. Remember Fichte's words, 'You must fashion him, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot desire something different from what you want him to desire.' This photo shows the public shaming of Jewish students in a German classroom. Virtually every single one of the founders of American schooling had made the pilgrimage to Germany, and many of these men wrote widely circulated reports praising the Teutonic methods. Horace Mann's famous Seventh Report of 1844 was perhaps the most important of these. 33 years after that fateful invention of the Central School Institution, at the behest of Horace Mann and many other leading citizens, we borrowed the Prussian educational model and made it our own. In 1896, the famous John Dewey, then at the University of Chicago, said that independent, self-reliant people were a counterproductive anachronism in the collective society of the future. In modern society, said Dewey, people would be defined by their associations, not by their own individual accomplishments. In such a world, people who read too well or too early are dangerous because they become privately empowered. They know too much and know how to find out what they don't know by themselves without consulting experts. And those people can't be controlled. Dewey said the great mistake of traditional pedagogy was to make reading and writing constitute the bulk of early schoolwork. He advocated that the phonics method of teaching reading be abandoned and replaced by the whole word method, not because the latter was more efficient. He admitted that it was less efficient, but because independent thinkers were produced by hard books, thinkers who cannot be socialized very easily. By socialization, Dewey meant a program of social objectives administered by the best thinkers in government. This was a giant step on the road to state socialism, the form pioneered in Prussia, and it is a vision radically disconnected with the American past, its historic hopes and dreams. In 1889, the U.S. Commissioner of Education, William Torrey Harris, assured a railroad magnate, Collis Huntington, that American schools were scientifically designed to prevent overeducation from happening. The average American would be content with his humble role in life, said Harris, because he would not be tempted to think about any other role. My guess is that Harris meant he would not be able to think about any other role. Harris, talking about students, wrote, 99 out of 100 are automata, careful to walk in prescribed paths, careful to follow the prescribed custom. This is not an accident, but the result of substantial education, which, scientifically defined, is the subsumption of the individual. So much for acting and not being acted upon. In 1950, Nobel Prize recipient Bertrand Russell once observed that American schooling was among the most radical experiments in human history, and that America was deliberately denying its children the tools of critical thinking. When you want to teach children to think, you begin by treating them seriously when they are young, giving them responsibilities, talking to them candidly, providing privacy and solitude for them, and making them readers and thinkers of significant thoughts from the beginning. That's if you want to teach them to think. There is no evidence that this has been a state purpose since the start of compulsion schooling. I think the best quote from Russell summarizes the impact of many educational systems today. A well-educated system is likely to be incapable of discovery, since he will respect his elders and betters, reverence the great men of the past generation, and look with horror upon all subversive doctrines. While our modern educational structure promotes dependence on and subservience to a system of carefully filtered information and values determined by others, the self-reliant know how to learn on their own, draw their own conclusions, follow their own interests, and forge their own path in consultation with the Lord. If we aren't careful to inculcate the principles of self-reliant learning in what we teach, we may well be hurting as much as we're helping in terms of self-reliance. School teaches participants to trust in the omniscience and beneficence of the system. It can be difficult to see the error in this view until it's too late. This picture is my favorite because it represents the way I personally felt about school. It seems we often romanticize education to be something quite different from what our own experience actually was. Like broccoli, although we don't want any more than we absolutely have to have, we generally consider it something good for other people. What was your personal experience with formal schooling and learning? Adam Smith's observation that the manufacturing process for straight pins became from 240 to 4,800 times more efficient through the specialization of labor tasks is an elegant and timely example of the benefits possible through specialization of labor. All things being equal, an economy that engages in specialization of labor will produce more than one that doesn't. But an economic participant whose labor is specialized gives up something very important in trade for that increased efficiency, and that is freedom. Specialized workers become highly dependent upon the system in which they participate. Consider me a typical knowledge worker. I read things, go to meetings, and type on my keyboard. I get paid tens, if not hundreds of times more than the Mexican worker that grew the onions I bought at Walmart last week that went into the soup my wife made. In that same store, I can buy red bell peppers harvested in Chile or tools made in China for a fraction of what it would cost me to produce them myself. And that's the beauty of it, until the system breaks down. If, for whatever reason, the economic system in which I participate breaks down, given my professional skills honed over the last 20 years of full-time work, I am legitimately at risk of starving to death. Now, it's a fairly well-established fact that people tend to underestimate the likelihood of really bad things happening. Taleb wrote a really good book called The Black Swan, if you're interested in that topic. But the point is, as believing Latter-day Saints, we have absolutely no excuse to ignore what the Scriptures clearly state will happen between today and the Savior's second coming. From a single verse, D&C 87:6, we are promised that, and thus with the sword and by bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague and earthquake, and the thunder of heaven, and the fierce and vivid lightning also shall the inhabitants of the earth be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of an almighty God, until the consumption decreed hath made a full end of all nations. Traditional education and the specialized labor roles it encourages can help members increase their self-reliance in functional economies. But if that's the only path we advocate, we are setting our members up for catastrophic failure when chaos comes. And come it will. That's why I found Mike Murray's definition of self-reliance profound. Self-reliance means you can survive when the famine comes. Central to maturity is embracing the role of creator, rather than simply being a consumer. Adults contribute to the world around them, rather than passively sampling the fruits of one's labor, or of others' labor. Adults build and grow and create things. Children of any age use these works, or even further removed, simply become fans of them. Much of our everyday lives are spent in the central activity of consumption, choosing. In high school and college, our schedules are largely set. We must simply choose the classes and extracurricular activities we prefer. We choose our clothes, choose our music, choose our entertainment, our vehicles, our home, and choose the accessories and furniture to decorate them. We choose who to include in our Facebook friends list and on which things in our news feed to bestow a like. My kids spend hours posting pictures and comments to garner likes from their friends and followers. It's this confusion of social value and real value that leaves so many young adults dazed and confused at the prospects of entering adulthood. What we are not often asked to do is create. We are served up prepackaged options and only tasked with selecting our favorites from among them. Rarely are we expected to create the options ourselves. And yet most every adult role, not just that of parent, requires the act of creation. Bosses must create expectations for their employees. Employees create projects for their bosses. The self-employed must create their own schedule and vision for their job. How do we encourage young men to embrace the lost art of creation? All adults reach a point where the thing they want to do or read or use is not available from a pre-selected menu of options and must be created themselves. Without much experience in creating, many adults do not know how to respond to this juncture other than to whine and to express their disappointment that pre-existing institutions, publications, and businesses have not met their expectations. By the way, Jeff Bezos describes the principal differentiation between innovators and non-innovators as people that actually do something about those pain points rather than just complaining about them. Growing up is hard to do because there exists a large gap between the experience we gain in creation growing up and the amount of creation required of us as adults. Last year I taught a management course at LDS Business College. It was a capstone class to pull together all their business learning before graduating. About half the class was from Latin America, half from the United States. I was curious to know if they understood where metal came from. I asked them, and they didn't know, except one fellow, the smartest in the class, with a very unsure look on his face, guessed, from rocks. How did nearly all these students get through elementary, middle, high school, and the first 2 years of junior college without knowing where metal comes from? What kind of outcomes would encourage self-reliant learning for both economic optimization and surviving the famine, as well as foster the desire to create, so often dormant among the youth of today? This may give you some ideas. We think the young men ought to be encouraged to learn how to create, using the resources that naturally surround them, how to sustain life. We might call the program Civilization Builders because it teaches the fundamental skills necessary to rebuild civilization from scratch. What skills would be required for someone to be able to walk into the hills and be able to survive? That would be real self-reliance. Here are some of the basics. Make fire using local natural resources. Find or make potable water from a local natural resource. Make metal. Make tools. Use your tools and local natural resources to make a shelter. Make cordage. Hunt or trap an animal, skin, kill, and eat it. Use tools and animal skin to make shoes. Identify and harvest 10 local wild edible plants and live on them for a week. Make pottery. Raise a small flock of animals. Plant and harvest enough food to feed your family for a week. Nearly all of these have associated scriptural references. For example, how many of these did Nephi know how to do or figure out how to do? The ultimate objective might be to completely provide for and sustain yourself for a week without any outside intervention. This program, which could start as an international replacement for scouting, could be our self-reliance offering for young kids aged 8 through 14. This would help turn our young men into creators, makers, and builders that won't die when the famine comes. This would provide a tremendous foundation for any career. It reminds me of the story Mike Davis told me about how in the engineering department at Hewlett-Packard, they preferred to hire engineers from Utah State over those from Stanford because the ones from Utah State typically knew how to solder, where those from Stanford didn't. A little bit of practical knowledge sometimes goes a long way. What are your thoughts about how we might fashion a program to help overcome some of these foundational and cultural and institutionalized things that oppose self-reliance, broadly speaking? How could we help people want to become self-reliant learners? Could we promote some type of great books type reading program? Remember, when you want to teach children to think, you begin by treating them seriously when they are little, giving them responsibilities, talking to them candidly, providing privacy and solitude for them, and making them readers and thinkers of significant thoughts from the beginnings. Independent thinkers are produced by hard books and great writing. Here's some potential great reads that we might want to encourage people to consume, which would normally fall outside the planned curriculum courses that they presently have. We might encourage the formation of reading groups to discuss these. In terms of education, we see that sometimes, like the article that I sent out earlier this year, sometimes it takes a brave teacher at a school next to a dump in Mexico to ignore the prevailing methodologies that he learned in school and develop his own new radical teaching method to help students unlock their potential. His student pictured here earned the highest score in Mexico on the National Math exam. And what was this radical new approach? He let the students control their own learning. He asked them important questions and provided just enough guidance to let them figure out the answers themselves. How do we get people to become independent thinkers? There seems to be a direct linkage between wanting to take responsibility for your own needs and actions and trusting your own judgment enough to stand alone in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. Our schooling was structured to create 99% automata, conforming people. How do we encourage the 1%? Rumor has it this guy grew up to be a product manager. I want you to consider this quote for a second. When all think alike, then no one is thinking. And consider in conjunction with this verse in D&C 112, Verily, verily, I say unto you, darkness covereth the earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people, and all flesh has become corrupt before my face. Thank you.